Driving into the office the other day, I heard a fascinating report on National Public Radio where the interviewer was talking to a woman who does research in the area of artificial voices, artificial speech devices for people who either never have been able to speak or for one reason or another had lost their ability to speak. And it was really a fascinating piece. She talked about some of the challenges that are faced by people who are dependent upon artificial voices. One of the most obvious is that many of those voices sound very artificial. They were created by a computer and they just don't sound like a real person talking. Or if they are a bit more realistic, they don't sound like me. They sound like someone else. I would never sound like that. And this researcher who was being interviewed explained a technology that she had developed 7 years ago where she would record just a sound made by someone who couldn't speak. Most people who are unable to speak can produce a sound. They could produce an ah, just as the same sound. And so she would record that sound, which really is the imprint of their voice, and then using a computer program, generate a signature voice for them based on the sound produced by their own voice box. It was really fascinating. Well, she told about being at a convention recently where several people who were dependent on artificial speech devices were having a conversation. And the crazy thing was all of them had exactly the same voice. And she said listening to them was really strange because though there were 4 people talking, they all had identical voices. Well, from there the interview went to a young teenage girl who had never been able to speak. I don't remember what the condition was with which she was born, but she'd never been able to speak. And so she was using an artificial voice. And interviewing her, this young girl said she didn't like her voice because it didn't sound like her. And they said, well, why doesn't it sound like you? And she said, well, it sounds like an older woman. I wouldn't sound like that. So they had gotten a hold of a recording of this young girl's making a sound several years earlier and had produced a signature voice for her using sounds that she had created herself. And the interview included a recording of the first time this young teenager said anything with really her own voice. And her mother, who was also a part of the interview, said that as soon as her daughter spoke these words, her face lit up and a big smile came on her face, and she said, "I like it. That sounds like me." To which the mother replied, after all, everyone needs a voice. Everyone needs a voice. Well, I got thinking about people who over the years have needed a voice, who didn't have a voice of their own. Slaves in the 18th century had no voice of their own. William Wilberforce became their voice. Dalits in India, outcasts in India, had no voice for themselves. But Gandhi became their voice, and later, in another context, Mother Teresa became their voice. Blacks in the late 50s and early 60s in America had no voice of their own, and Martin Luther King Jr. became their voice. Orphans in Korea in the 1950s had no voice of their own, but Bob Pierce, who became the founder of World Vision, became their voice. Everyone needs a voice. You know, there are people and groups in the world today who are looking for someone to be their voice. Children who are being abused. Who speaks for them? Women who are being trafficked. Where is their voice? Who speaks for them? Or I think of unreached people groups by the hundreds around the world who've never heard the good news of the gospel. Who speaks for them? Who cries out for them? Who asks for the good news on their behalf? That brings me to 2 questions. First, to whom are you giving voice today? For whom are you speaking? And finally, are you willing to be a voice for God? After all, as Paul says, we are His ambassadors. We've been appointed by Him to speak on His behalf. Everyone needs a voice.